works out. Nobody seems to know exactly how this works beyond the government statements. So, well, call this one a test case. Maybe not the most ideal test case, but we'll keep an eye on that one.
That's true. I don't think it'd be an ideal test case given how much... I'm sure there's problems there, but it's also quite clear that a lot of major governments around the world have got it in for the regime in Venezuela, and it's not entirely sure that they'll be left alone to try and run this experiment without interference either.
This is very true.
So yeah, there's lots of problems with that as an example. But the Common Weal have got a paper coming out, What Currency an Independent Scotland Should Use, and it seems that you're firmly in the camp of an independent Scottish currency, not going with the pound or the euro or anything else. Why is that the best option?
Yeah, so this is a paper that, as we're recording this, we released today. We've been talking about currency for a couple of years now. We produced a paper in 2016 that explored the sort of reasonable options, and we've eventually settled on, an independent Scotland should have its own currency. To give a very, very quick overview of the options, right now, the status quo of Scotland within the UK, we've got the UK pound that's controlled by the Bank of England. The Bank of England sets things like interest rates and inflation targets, and it's doing it, at least in theory, on the basis of the economy of the entire UK. Take in all the caveats that we talked about just earlier about the inequality of the UK, the focus on London, that's fair enough, but at least it should be looking at the whole of the UK when it's making those decisions. If Scotland was independent and it had its own currency, it would have its own central bank, and it would be making those decisions for Scotland. One of the options we talked about in 2014 was the idea of a currency union between Scotland and the rest of the UK. That would look a lot like what we have now, except that Scotland would have a dedicated member on the Bank of England's board, dedicated to speaking up for Scotland's interests. How much of an impact that would have? Well, you can argue about that. The last reasonable option anyway, is what's known as sterlingization. This is where we would just circulate the pound within the Scottish economy unofficially. Now, this would mean that the Scottish government would have to buy all of the currency or borrow all of the currency that it wanted to circulate. It also means that the Bank of England would be setting interest rates based on the economy of the rest of the UK, the remaining UK. It would have no obligation to take Scotland into account when it made these decisions, and there would be no direct influence that the Scottish government could have over the Bank of England's decisions. So that, to me, is the big weakness of this option. It does leave Scotland fairly vulnerable to events that are out with its control.
Are there any other countries that operate with that kind of system? Maybe Panama or something with the dollar?
There are a few. Panama and Ecuador both use the US dollar in this way. Montenegro uses the euro. Liechtenstein uses the Swiss franc. Now, one thing about these examples, each of those countries have a GDP of an economy about 1% the size of the currency zone that they're using. Scotland's GDP is about 8% the size of the UK's. So if you've got the Bank of England, not taking Scotland into account when it's making its decisions, if it's ignoring 8% of this economic activity, especially activity that involves things like Scottish oil, you can imagine that might well put some instability into their estimates and their projections. It's not clear how this would work long term, and it's never really been tried with a country the relative size of Scotland.
So even that is a lot of people believe that staying with the pound and doing that's the safest option, but even that would be running a major risk because it's not been tried before.
Basically, yeah.
If a Scottish currency gives you control of all of those economic, I hate to use the word economic levers, but if it gives you control over certain aspects of the economy that you wouldn't have control of otherwise,
yeah.
What are the difficulties with setting up and changing over to that system?
I wouldn't describe them as difficulties. It's quite an involved and technical process. The paper we've just published sort of lays out how Scotland would do this. Essentially, we are looking at the transition period between holding a referendum and actually becoming an independent country. Now, we're saying that process would take about 3 years. This is a bit longer than the 18 months that we were talking about in 2014 with the Scotland's Future White Paper. But one has to remember that document was talking a lot more about sharing infrastructure with the UK. You don't need to take up take the time to set up a central bank if you don't have a central bank because you're just in a currency union. But something also to maybe reflect on since Brexit is, the Brexit process has a 2-year timetable. And if you're looking at that, and even if the UK had been approaching that with any degree of, sanity, sense,
competence,
that 2-year timetable looks rather tight. So we're saying take 3 years and build absolutely everything you need, your customs and borders, your civil service, your central bank, your currency, that's just the C's, and just do it right. So we start the process just after the referendum. You set up all your IT systems, you start a design process to design the notes and coins, you recruit for your central bank, you start letting shops Joe price. What we would do is peg the Scottish currency to the pound 1-to-1 initially. That just makes the transition a lot easier. Then you allow people to set up their bank accounts and start converting their savings, perhaps converting their mortgages and their pensions. Then you start allowing people to pay devolved taxes or receive social security in the new currency, and you gradually build things up. And then on Independence Day, the Scottish currency becomes the sole legal tender of Scotland, the sole official currency, and you've transitioned. And then come independence, the normal politics of a normal independent country kicks in, and you can decide how to manage your currency after that. That includes, if we still want to keep the Scottish currency pegged to the sterling, we can. If we want to do something different, we can.
And where does that leave us in the international scene at that point? Because although most business transactions worldwide are done with the dollar, some are done with the euro, and I imagine some with the pound, but would that give us a more difficult position internationally, or would it be something we could easily control?
In terms of the payments and transactions, most companies that do this sort of thing are already multi-currency companies and organisations, so adding one more isn't really an onerous task. Probably the thing that a lot of people focus on is the potential for financial speculators to attack the currency, especially if we've got it pegged to the sterling. You might want to attack that peg the same way that the pound was attacked in 1992, the so-called Black Wednesday event. But even this worry is something that all normal countries deal with, and they've got the tools to deal with it. Your central bank has the ability to manipulate its foreign exchange reserve levels or its interest rates to fend off these attacks. And while the UK had some really bad experiences, and it's actually, you can see it in a lot of UK politics, it kind of scarred the UK for many years, even to today. It doesn't like to talk about 1992, but the history of currency speculators shows that actually most attacks on currencies fail. Over half of them are successfully defended against.
But also the fact that if you use 1992 as the example then staying with the UK pound is no guarantee that these kind of things won't happen anyway.
Well, this is it. I mean, the UK pound has been attacked before. It has also the pound is no longer pegged to another currency, but it now freely floats in the market. But we saw the day after the Brexit referendum, the devaluation of the pound and the impact that had on prices. It caused imported goods to go up in price. That includes quite a lot of food and clothing, which is again something that a lot of ordinary people rely on. But in this sort of interconnected world, it also had this slightly perverse effect that normally we would have expected British exports to become more competitive. That didn't happen to a great extent because it turns out that a lot of British exports rely on imported components to build. So our exports kind of went up in price as well.
Another Brexit benefit that's not going to happen then.
Well, again, I would be watching out on B-Day the next March to see what happens to the pound then, and well, who knows if anyone could know ahead of time what's going to happen to the pound then they've probably got a very large bet on it at the moment.
Yeah, so it could stay the same, or it could nosedive, or.
Well, I've seen people say that it could go to one pound equals €1, or even £1 equals $1. Who knows?
God, Brexit. Oh, God, okay. And so, no, there's no other way to look at it. You see, every day you see it and you just go, oh, God. I can't think about it in any other way now.
I've got a little thing on Twitter wherever I see the UK doing something stupid about Brexit, I retweet it just with the slogan "Face Desk," because that's the appropriate reaction to the whole thing. And I've started getting messages from people seriously concerned about the state of my desk. Not so much about the face, though.
I was thinking of getting some sort of Boris Johnson voodoo doll for every, like you can stick pins in it or something. But
do you have enough pins?
All right. So, are there any examples of countries that have done something similar to what you're proposing Scotland do, and how did it work out for them?
To launch their own currencies. There are loads of examples, to be honest, and most of them have done it in a fairly smooth transition. Quite often in rather fraught circumstances. I can think even of examples of the countries in the Balkans when Yugoslavia broke up. They managed to launch their currencies and keep them to some sort of relative degree of stability, even while there was conflict there. So to say that Scotland would be unable to launch a currency is ludicrous.
No, Scotland's uniquely unable to do anything, according to some commentators. But so, what countries that you've looked at have made a real success of launching their own currency?
I would say probably the best example at the moment is Czechoslovakia, where they did initially try to form a currency union between the Czech Republic and the Republic of Slovakia. That was fairly badly handled, and it collapsed within a couple of weeks. But after that, both countries launched their own currencies, did it, to a relative degree of success. In fact, Slovakia then went on to join the euro. So I would say that's an example of two new nations making the choices that best suit them.
I think Czech Republic's been doing quite well since it's been independent.
Both countries have been doing fairly well. They've both been playing to their strengths.
Let's do a hypothetical then. So if Scotland becomes independent before Brexit happens and Scotland remains in the European Union, what would be the problems with the euro?
Right. To be honest, I think we're now at the point where getting independence before Brexit Day is slim to nil, even if we take a fairly extended transition period post next March. I think we're going to have to accept Scotland's going to have a break in its EU membership and then is going to have to reapply. But taking that, one of the things about rejoining the euro, rejoining the EU, I should say, is that by a strict reading of the rules, if you want to be an EU member, you need to have your own fully functional central bank, which implies you have to have your own currency, which implies that if you're sterlingized, if you've kept the pound, you can't join the EU. Now, there is a slight complication to that in that Montenegro, that I mentioned previously, is using the euro unilaterally. It's not a Eurozone member. It's trying to join the EU. The process is being complicated by, because of this. The European Central Bank has been spending several years trying to work out how to integrate Montenegro into the EU, without Montenegro having the full central bank available to it. It's still not quite clear if when Montenegro joins the EU, will it join as a Eurozone member or will it stay apart and still unilaterally using the euro? However that works out, you could apply those rules to Scotland if it was sterlingized, but there is another big caveat there in that Montenegro is using the currency of the political union it's trying to join, whereas a sterlingized Scotland would not be. So, yeah, having your own currency makes this a lot easier. It gives Scotland the choices. I mean, it's not an absolute given that an independent Scotland would want to join the EU. That's a discussion to be had. But I would say that if you're wanting to form an independent Scotland, regardless of your individual opinions on the policies, you have to do it in a way that allows that discussion to take place, which is another reason why I support a Scottish currency. It gives Scotland those options. It gives Scotland that future neutral approach to policy. Whereas if you're sterlingized, you kind of get locked into a certain path.
Okay, so more control over the economy with an independent Scottish currency. It would allow us an easier